Huge interest in our first guest. I'm delighted to be welcoming him on. He has written a book. He's published a book. It's only out. Well, it's only been out a few weeks, really. It's called Britain's Secret Wars. How and why the United Kingdom sponsors conflict around the world. It's a terrific book. He studies, the author, the philosophy of blindness and visual impairment at the University of Plymouth, and he started researching politics and geopolitics after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I've read the book. It really is essential reading. Britain's Secret Wars, How and Why the UK Sponsors Conflict Around the World. Let's welcome to the programme Tim Coles. Tim, you're very welcome. How are you?
Hello, I'm really good, Richie. How are you?
I'm thrilled you're on. The book is terrific. I'm no sycophant, Tim. It really is. It's wonderfully timely, of course.
Oh, thanks very much.
I can't recommend it highly enough. People can find it at good retailers, good book retailers, and of course all good online retailers as well. I'll give you a laugh, Tim. A lot of Twitter interest in this. We get hundreds of tweets during the programme. Just before coming on air, at M. Falstein says, Richie, ask Tim if he knows how many countries Western governments have attempted regime changes in since the Second World War. I hear 50. Now, Tim, I'm not putting you on the spot at all. You don't have to know the answer to that. But I'm guessing, Tim, whether we know the figure or not, it's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, that's about right. According to Bill Bloom and his excellent book, Killing Hope, it's about, between 50 and 70 countries after World War II. So, yeah, that's quite a lot in such a short space of time.
Between 50 and 70. By the way, wonderful to have people like John Pilger and Noam Chomsky endorsing the book as well. Tim, I'm going to start off by asking you to chat a little bit about some things that the former French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas said on French television last year. And that was that back in 2008, 2009, dark actors in London connected with the intelligence services were speaking to him about doing something in Syria. Now, because Syria is so topical, because it's so important, because there's news breaking out of there every day, I want to talk a little bit about what we can prove that the British intelligence agents, what hand they have played in the destabilisation of Syria.
Yeah, there was an attempt back in the 1950s to stage a similar kind of invasion under false pretexts. So it's not a new thing. And as many of your listeners will know, the whole Middle East region and North Africa is essential to control because of the oil. In fact, the Foreign Office in Britain said in 1947 that any country interested in world domination considers the Middle East a vital prize. But there's much more to it than that. What appears to be happening in the Middle East and North Africa is largely a demolition job. You can look at country after country, and Britain and America especially, and France as well, are systematically destroying many of these countries. It's kind of like a World War III in the Middle East. And the ultimate goal is to bring in a European Union-style trading area. And there's even a name for it. It's called the Broader Middle East and North Africa Initiative. And the US wants to first set up bilateral trading agreements and then move into a more regional unification. But first of all, they have to destroy and dismantle various political systems. Some of the governments there, like the Saudis, are willing to an extent to go along with this. Some of them, like Assad, are not. And in fact, the British House of Commons Library had a statement that Assad was thought to be a reformer. In other words, he was going to privatize a lot of Syrian industry. But it turns out that he wasn't really making those kind of so-called reforms. And so a decision was made somewhere along the way to get rid of Assad or keep him in power, but ultimately destroy the whole of Syria. And the quote from Dumas is a good one, because that's a really serious figure, former French foreign minister, saying this on television. We also have British Ministry of Defence documents, Strategic Trends Programme it's called. They publish a few of them every couple of years, they update it. And the one in 2010, which made projections out to the year 2040, says that states will use proxies to distance themselves from various military actions. So that means Britain, America, France will use proxy forces like the Free Syrian Army. And this actually predates the Arab Spring, which took place in 2011. So that's one evidence, plus Dumas, that's another. And in fact, the semi-official Elite UK Forces website, which promotes the SAS, thinks the SAS is wonderful, they had a report saying that British forces, French and American forces, had been training the anti-Assad rebels since November 2011. Well, that predates what we were told in the mainstream media.
That's right.
That the rebels were getting assistance, quote unquote, from the British and the Americans and the French. So if you read the official documentation, you find plenty of evidence that the government not only will use terrorists, and in fact it even says in the Strategic Trends Programme that many of these proxies will use what they call non-conventional means, meaning terrorism, and even uses the word terrorism. But they say that we must engage in conspiracies in order to deceive the public. They understand that public perception is not going to go on with it, so they have to somehow try and make it legitimate. And they can make these kind of wars legitimate by concocting lies and pretexts, whether it was Colonel Gaddafi in Libya supposedly going to commit an ethnic cleansing in Benghazi, for which no evidence was ever presented.
None.
Or whether it's Assad supposedly using chemical weapons when numerous experts in chemical weapons have said that the footage doesn't look authentic. And on it goes. So any kind of secrecy, pretext, deception is in fact required, because the war planners know full well that the general public won't agree to what is being planned.
We've one of the things that's notable about the book is everything is subjective, of course, and you wrote it because you've got strong opinions about what's happening in the world. But it reads objective, Tim. You know, it's very easy to read. It's gripping at times when you read it. But it's also very academic. It's all kind of three things in one. And one of the things I wanted you to kind of give us an opinion on, because we're going out on multiple platforms, we do have people listening to the programme who buy the Daily Telegraph or Daily Mail or Daily Mirror line on whatever and accepts that as a truth. And we offer different opinions. They will believe, because they're told, that what's happening in Syria there was a popular uprising against they call them the regime, I call them the government of Syria, and that the Assad government brutally put that down and began committing war crimes. Now, in your investigation and your research while preparing to write your book, what did you find to be the truth about those allegations, Tim?
What happened, as far as I can tell, is that there were legitimate concerns among the populations of numerous countries across the Middle East and North Africa. Egypt is one example. The West had been backing the Mubarak dictatorship in Egypt, which was vicious enough to give the Muslim Brotherhood, which Britain helped to create back in the 1930s, to give them a popular support base. So the Muslim Brotherhood would provide welfare for people in mosques, for example. And this generalizes across the region, whether it's Hamas in Gaza or whether it's various groups in Algeria and Morocco. So Islamist groups have provided a kind of social welfare to a degree. And this is in opposition to secular governments or regimes like the Assad. And what I found is that the United States, and William Engdahl has done some good research on this as well.
Very good work, William Engdahl, on this, yeah.
The United States realized that sooner or later there was going to be a mass uprising against oppression. And it might not come out in the US's favor. It might be too left-wing. It might be too progressive. So the United States, as part of its broader Middle East and North Africa agenda to create this kind of European Union trading bloc, decided to hijack a lot of these groups. And one of them in Egypt, I mention Egypt because one of those groups called Kifaya, which I think means enough, they were actually invited to the US and given training in how to use social media to try and get rid of the Mubarak regime, which the US considered had become too corrupt and was hated by the population.
Tim, can I just jump in there, because this is absolutely brilliant. This is vital stuff. Being invited to the United States, we've found out through our own research and through listening to people like Ray McGovern, former CIA officer, and other former CIA people on the programme, that businessman and speculator George Soros has his paw prints or his fingerprints all over some of these kind of training and helping some of these protest groups. What do you make of that?
Yeah, in Central Asia as well, from what I can see, particularly targeting China, because China essentially agreed to World Bank and IMF structural adjustments in the 1980s. So the US is very interested in making sure that China follows the program. And in fact, John Pilger's new film is going to be about how the US is circling China with the military. And so you have people like Soros who use what they call soft power, which means propaganda and bribery and so on, to try and move those countries in Central Asia away from China's influence and bring it to the US. And particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, the US, in fact, in 2005, there was a report by a colonel in America called John C. Buss, B-U-S-S, if you can find that. And he talks about manufacturing democracy. He talks about using social media to try and cause revolutions from within to get rid of people like Gaddafi and Assad and Mubarak, who were not going along with the program. And so I think a lot of these genuine concerns that people had in the region, they didn't necessarily want to get rid of their governments. They just wanted less oppression and more democracy. But the US felt that they could easily hijack. And it's also worth remembering that as people like Gaddafi and Assad were being condemned in the West for their oppression, they were being armed by Britain and the US. So the SAS were in fact training Gaddafi's forces for a while after BP oil. And Tony Blair, you may remember Tony Blair with his deal in the desert, where he went to meet Gaddafi in a Bedouin tent, which was all staged for the media, according to the International Crisis Group. As soon as Gaddafi agreed to that, he was an ally, so the SAS were training his forces and so on. But his reforms were cosmetic, according to oil journals. They said that Gaddafi is not bringing about the kind of privatization reforms that we want. And he's not. There's also an agenda called Europe 2025, which is a pro-business agenda to increase tourism and privatize oil and gas and so on. Gaddafi was having none of that, so it was decided that he and Assad should be deposed.
I just want to do a quick recap, Tim. Tim Coles is on the programme, folks. This is essential listening. You're not hearing this on BBC Channel 4 or ITN today. This is the tragedy. It's criminal that you're not hearing this. His new book, Britain's Secret Wars, How and Why the UK Sponsors Conflict Around the World, has only been on the shelves a few weeks. It's absolutely vital reading. You'll find it in any good bookshop, and you'll find it on any good online retailer as well. It's terrific. It really is. Tim, we have listeners from all different backgrounds, and there's a friend of mine I went to university with, and she is considering getting into teaching now, which is a bit weird considering the problems with education in this country. But she's been doing a bit of research and said to me recently, you know, some of the things she said you talk about on your program, things like the coup d'etat in Iran in 1953, which was basically a coup at the behest, the removing of Mohammad Mossadegh, secular ruler, well, a secular president of Iran, at the behest of BP, a massive corporation. And she said, from what I can tell, this is not on the curriculum in high schools, in secondary schools in this country. And that's one of the reasons why books like yours are vital. But it's tragic, Tim, isn't it, to learn that? It's tragic to know that our children are going to school and they're not being told about these massively important events in the 20th century, like the coup d'etat in 1953. There's something seriously wrong if our children are not learning this.
That's right. The state is a violent institution, and education, especially historic education, is also violent. In fact, Churchill once said that education can be a weapon. And the history of education, state education and private education is even worse. Education in the UK, the history of it is very interesting because it started out as a means of social control. Millions of people living in absolute misery in England under aristocratic oppression, and they were being drained of their resources, and there were hunger and famines as well because markets were becoming internationalized. And in fact today the policymakers want to go back to that model, that 19th century model of globalization, where people are no longer producing their own food. They're dependent, for example, and that's just one example, on other countries for their food. So the population was at the stage of rioting in a big way, and that's why you had Chartism. And it was decided that various measures could be given to the public to stop them from rebelling. And that's where charity, a lot of charity comes from, where people can be oppressed through charity. So you had friendly societies and the Salvation Army and so on. So instead of people rebelling, they were given crumbs through charity organizations and friendly cooperatives. And education was a means of oppressing children as well. Suddenly you had schools being built in the Victorian era to get children into this particular system where they had to learn to be terrified of authority because they were going to be caned. And in a way, parents went along with this because they had starving children, so at least in school they were going to get a meal. So it was handy for the parents, but it ultimately meant that the children would be terrified of authority and be given, the bare minimal education just to be prepared for a life of working. So it's a very interesting history of education, so-called, what we could call indoctrination, terror, mind control in England. And also that England exported that to a lot of the colonies. There's an excellent book called Schooling as Violence, which shows that in British colonies, even today, children are often terrified because they're using the old Victorian model. So I think they have to keep this kind of information out of schools. But yes, it is a tragedy.
So just going to read a couple of tweets, Tim, because there's a massive amount of tweets coming in. Alex tweets that 5 years ago, Richie, I did a history GCSE at school. There was no Middle Eastern history in the entire course in the curriculum. Stevie tweets, the world needs more brave men like Tim, right to awake it from its slumber. I'll be buying a copy of your book, says Stevie. Wayne tweets, culture is the enemy of the natural holistic human. Born to grow and love, create. The state is violent. Its culture is to pervert, says Wayne. Huge interest in this. Keep your tweets coming in. It's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter, and it's richie@richieallen.co.uk. Tommy tweets this. Tim, before I mention Tommy's tweet, I'm just going to give a plug again to the book. It's Britain's Secret Wars by Tim Coles. It's listed as T.J. Coles, How and Why the United Kingdom Sponsors Conflict Around the World. There aren't many books like this, folks. There really aren't. And this is clinical analysis, not cynical, it must be said, clinical analysis of what's going on in our world today, who is behind it, what it's looking like now, why they're doing it, and where this is heading if it isn't stopped. Now, Tommy tweets this, and it's a really good question. Tim, he tweets, could the destabilisation in the East bring in turn the superpowers to potentially lock horns? How serious, Tim, do you think is the possibility of a serious global conflict between the West, Russia and China?
Yeah, it's really serious. And in fact, it's so serious that even the Ministry of Defence in Britain realised this. They have a document called Strategic Trends Programme 2036. And in that document, it talks about a doomsday scenario. It actually uses the phrase doomsday scenario. And it talks about nanotechnology, genetic engineering, and especially nuclear confrontation. And elsewhere in the document, it says that the fact that states such as Russia, China, Britain, the US have nuclear weapons and are pursuing geostrategic interests, this could lead to brinkmanship and misunderstanding, to quote the document. So the very people planning these wars are well aware that this aggressive policy, which is actually called full-spectrum dominance, the United States has a name. You can find that in Vision for 2020 by the US Space Command. The fact that they are going to pursue this program, and yet they are also aware of how dangerous it is for everybody, tells you that these people are certainly psychopathic. And many researchers in the alternative media have been researching around military bases where the military elites are actually constructing large underground bases to shield themselves from potential destruction, because they seem to be well aware that these policies could potentially become terminal, and so they are having they've got measures to protect. And in fact, one of your listeners a few nights ago was tweeting about rods from the gods.
That's right. Yeah.
What the document that I'm talking about, Strategic Trends Programme 2036, it actually mentions that. It's either rods from the gods or rods from God, depending on who's talking about it. It says that these will be large tungsten or uranium rods, which will be dropped from space platforms onto targets on Earth. And even if they're not used, it's a hell of a threat. But if they are used, then they have plausible deniability, because you just have some object falling from the sky causing mass destruction, possibly earthquakes, as your listener was saying. And this is part of the overall weaponization of space program, which is designed for global intimidation. And in fact, what we can prove is happening is that under Obama, the United States launched the first known space weapon, the 37B, I think it's called. And this is a geosynchronous machine that can hover over any region and either ram into satellites and kill satellites, or else it can perform missions that are secret. Probably they've already had space weapons for a long, long time, but this is one we can definitely prove is now in orbit. So, yeah, it's all getting really serious, and it's going to continue for a long time.
You'll know as well, Tim, I'm not going to get into it here because it's not the place to get into it. And this is why guys like you are so important, and I don't want to be kissing your backside, but it's vital to read a book written like that. I mean, this is the sort of book I would expect to have been recommended when I was studying history at third level years ago. You know, it's the sort of book that should be on the reading. As I said, it's clinical, it's academic. You will know, of course, that myself and the chief carrier of this programme, we believe, and I don't believe it because he tells me to believe it, I've come to believe it. I came out of the mainstream. I believe that ultimately they want to get rid of a lot of us. But I'm not going to get into that. It's not the time or the place for it, but that's where I think it's going. Huge interest in this. I've just tweeted the link to where you can find Tim's book. Let me just scroll down there. Darren tweets, it's absolutely insane. The tragedy knowing that there's so many of us and so few of these people. Does Tim have any ideas, Darren says, as to how we can break this cycle of madness. I mean, Tim, this is the $64 million question. They are a handful of lunatics. There's the people behind these things. We are legion. But stopping them, Tim, I mean, that's the kind of thing that keeps you up nights, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, and it really requires a life, a dedicated life. Because a lot of people, and we learned this from the invasion of Iraq in 2003, a lot of people, the millions that marched across the country and the million or two in London, unfortunately, most of them gave up after that because the war went ahead anyway. But you cannot give up, and there have been some victories. For example, in 2014, when Israel was destroying Gaza again, as it does a few years, and of course keeps Gaza barely alive in the meantime, there was a company called UAV Engines near Birmingham, and they were producing drone parts for Elbit, which is a company based in Israel. And there were some brave protesters who occupied the roof of the UAV Engines factory, the Elbit 9 they were called, and they were arrested for racially trespass, some Zionist thing that they were supposedly it was a racist. But the case was actually dropped against them because Elbit and UAV Engines and the British government refused to disclose the information about their drone export because obviously was engaged in war crimes by supplying these machines to Israel so that it could mercilessly attack civilians in Gaza. And so ultimately Elbit had terrible publicity, and the protesters who took direct were that the case against them was dropped. And Campaign Against the Arms Trade at the same time was going to bring a case against the British government for supplying Israel weapons. But I think under pressure from the Zionists, they decided not to. But this time, Campaign Against the Arms Trade is bringing a case against the British government for supplying weapons as Saudi Arabia destroys Yemen as part of this demolition job across the Middle East that I mentioned.
Do you know what's terrible, Tim, about that? Do you know what's brutal about that? Is it's bad enough to sell and send these weapons to the Saudis to carpet bomb into oblivion innocent people in Yemen. But we sent officers there to make sure that they knew how to use them, didn't we?
That's right, and in fact it also has a history. And out that before the war with the North, the central government under Saleh pressing the population in the south, and the British were training the Interior Ministry, which according to various rights organisations was responsible to various forms of pressure.
We just seem to have lost Tim momentarily there. It was just deteriorating the lines there just in the last couple of seconds. So I'm very quickly going to disconnect from him and reconnect to him there and see can we get him back on. Bit of a shame that the line, as you heard there, was just deteriorating just a little bit at the end. Let's hope it's better when we reconnect. Sometimes when you reconnect it improves. That's not a scientific theory now. That's just a theory. But I do have a phone number because I want to get another few minutes out of Tim. I don't want to lose this. If you're just joining the programme, you're with the Richie Allen Show, of course, brought to you in association with davidicke.com, Fab Radio, alternate current radio in the US, and of course the TuneIn app and all of that. Now we're struggling to connect with him, but as luck would have it, we do have a number for him. So I'm going to kind of fluster or kind of bluster me way through talking to you while I dial that number. These things are sent to try you, as the saying goes. So I do have a number for him. I'm going to give a quick ring to that and see can we get him back on the line there. If I've done that right, I have. Okay. Keep those tweets coming in. Lots of them coming in, by the way, as well, on this, unsurprisingly, at Richie Allen Show. And the email is richie@richieallen.co.uk. Now, how do I do this? Yeah, I've got it now, I think. Yeah, right. Okay. Let's see, can we get him on the old dog and bone then? The old dog and bone. Right. It's ringing now. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to do this again. This is very unprofessional, by the way. You normally should take a break and do this, but I couldn't be arsed, you know. I'm going to do it this way.
Hello?
Tim, it's Richie.
Hi, sorry about that. The computer crashed.
Hey, these things happen. The line just began to deteriorate, but thankfully we had the old belt and braces, Tim. We had the old phone number.
It would be a good idea to give you the landline.
Yeah, well, Claire is brilliant as a producer anyway. She'd insist on it. We were talking about the fact that bad enough that the Saudis were given these weapons of mass destruction, which I think doesn't really cover what they are, evil as they are. But we sent officers over there to stand in the basically in the what would you call it, in the war chambers, in the control rooms, while we dropped these bombs. Most people don't know this, Tim.
No, and also I found out that even before then, before the war in the north, the Salah government was oppressing people in the south, activists, journalists, union leaders, and in fact Britain was training the Interior Ministry, which, according to various human rights organizations, was responsible for torture. So this has a long history. It didn't just happen recently. It's a continuation of policy in the region. And I think it's probably going to get worse and worse until the region is destroyed, much like Europe was destroyed in World War II, and then rebuilt along lines that were favorable to Anglo-American interests.
We talked a little bit about education, didn't we? And we know that academisation, which is supported by the Conservative Party, and whether people like it or not, it might not be supported by Jeremy Corbyn and other Labour MPs, but I guess the vast majority of the Blairites that are still festering in the Labour Party and in the Parliamentary Party, they support it as well, Tim. It's a terribly bleak, awful, miserable world we're painting here, but people have to understand this is the way it is, don't they? They need to understand
this. Right, yes. Yes, you were talking about the right-wing elements in the so-called Labour Party. And, in fact, there's an interesting recent history of that after World War II, how a lot of United States spies were infiltrating and bribing the Labour Party. And, in fact, John Smith, who was the left-wing socialist champion for a while of the Labour Party, he was actually on the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group.
Again, you know, this is music to my ears, Tim, because when I criticise the latest socialist champion that's delivered to the people by the same lunatics who delivers them the Conservative Party and Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, I get castigated for it because I'm a nice guy, I think, and I think people listening to the programme, he's a nice fella. Surely he must support guys like Corbyn and Bernie Sanders and these people. But I've seen it all before, Tim. You know, I came through, I worked in commercial media. I've seen these guys come and go, these champions. And ultimately, they either fade away like Jeremy Corbyn eventually will, or they go the Tony Blair way, which is just continue on the Zionist policies of governments previous. So, do I detect from what you're saying that, like me, you are doubtful about effecting any change through the ballot box, Tim?
Unless we get involved in direct action and say to the Labour Party that Corbyn has a good track record on voting against war and voting for socialist policies, but in this current position he's giving in too easily to the pressures of the party, and unless we get together and say we will not stand for this and we want sort of the old Corbyn before he became a leader, then unfortunately Corbyn or anybody else is going to be subjected to the pressures of the party. And we've already seen that with his vacillating on Brexit or his quite timid response over the anti-Semitism allegations.
How embarrassing was it for him to have Shami Chakrabarti come back with a report that said, really, there's not really any endemic anti-Semitism here at all. One or two, members of the party and councillors have said some things which are pushing the boundaries of bad taste, but ultimately there's no anti-Semitism. What we needed was Corbyn, when he was on the Andrew Marr show 6 weeks ago, to aggressively go after Andrew Marr and say, I'm not going to tolerate accusations of anti-Semitism when people are expressing disgust at a genuine regime, a genuine apartheid and terrorist regime in the Middle East, which is brutally suppressing people in Gaza. Don't call us racist for saying that. I bet you he wishes, Tim, that he had said that then in light of the Chakrabarti report. What do you reckon?
I think so, and I think even more if he knew the feelings of the people that support him, that really he should be putting his foot down more. And it's so ironic that within the Labour Party, but also the Tories had been accusing Labour of being rife with anti-Semitism when they are indirectly, but ultimately they are supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine, the Azov battalion.
Tim, I want to thank you for writing the book. Folks, it's Britain's Secret Wars, How and Why the United Kingdom Sponsors Conflict Around the World. What I do, Tim, when I come across a book like yours, and you were kind enough to send it to me, is I read it and then I give it to somebody else and I tell them to read it and I tell them to give it to somebody else. But I say to our audience tonight, many of them saying they're on line looking for the book as we speak, get a copy of this book. If you've got teenage kids, give them this book. They're not going to learn in school, they're not going to learn anywhere else about this government's history, along with its cronies, the United States and France, and regimes like the Saudis, what they've been doing over the last century around the world and where it's leading us. Tim, you're a star, and I mean it when I say you're welcome back on this programme to join in the debate anytime you want. You've only got to pick up the phone.
That's really kind, Richie. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you ever so much for having me. It's been a good opportunity to talk.
Well, it's been an honour for us, and I meant that, by the way. Stay in touch with Claire, and anytime you feel like coming on, just drop us a message and we'll facilitate you, Tim. Thanks again. Great success. The book is a great success. It's a fantastic read, and I'm sure it's going to do really well for you. Thanks for doing it, Tim. Bye for now.
Thank you, Richie. Bye.
Marvellous stuff. Tim Cole's on the line to us there. Britain's Secret Wars, How and Why the UK Sponsors Conflict Around the World. How rare is it to get an academic like that who will go right up to the line with where this is all going, talking about the things he was talking about there. Absolutely vital. When that's on YouTube in the morning, share that widely, folks. Share that with the skeptics. Share that with those who say, it's all too conspiratorial. Brilliant stuff. Britain's Secret Wars is available online and at all good bookstores as well. I just saw a tweet from Paul Jackson asking to ask him how he got it published, which I suppose is a good question. And I will put that to Tim and ask him in the future. It's very academic, Paul. It's very easy to read. It reads very well. It's gripping, but it's an academic text, for want of a better word. And I understand why a publishing house looked at it and went, "Yeah, well, this is very good. It's historically accurate. Why not put it out there?"